Welcome to the discussion. My guest today is Todd Probert, the Vice President for Command, Control, Space, and Intelligence with Raytheon's Intelligence, Information, and Services. Todd, welcome to the discussion.
Thanks, Jason. Great to be here.
Before we get started, let me set some context for our discussion. You can't talk about technology in any regard without cybersecurity coming up as a main discussion point. Whether it's your smartphone, your laptop, your car, your toaster oven, concerns about hacking and turning your device into a bot are real and at the top of mind of most federal executives. The one area that hasn't received as much focus and attention are those systems in space and that support space, because like planes, phones, and computers, space systems, both on the ground and in orbit, are now potential targets for hackers. These systems are complex, so vulnerabilities can be introduced at almost any point of the supply chain, even while the spacecraft is in orbit. A recent paper from the Royal Institute of International Affairs, a nonprofit think tank, Chatham House, said the reliance on space-based systems and satellites could face greater risks of attack, especially during rising tensions that don't reach the level of real conflict. The Chatham paper found that China and Russia are using cyber attacks as part of their military and strategic doctrine, and they've increased their presence in space. In fact, NATO has had to deal with everything from GPS jamming to cyber attacks against satellite systems during military exercises, according to this Chatham paper. And the problem isn't new. A 2011 report from the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission highlighted 2 U.S. government satellites that have experienced interference, which experts say is a similar result that would come from a cyber attack on their control systems. Now, the difference is, of course, if your phone is hacked and your map takes you in the wrong direction, it's a little annoying. But if a satellite is hacked and it's feeding bad data to a plane, well, now we have a real problem. Agencies need to understand that these space systems face the same risks and they can apply the same mitigation to those risks, but they have to get it done because otherwise the implications are much bigger if they get it wrong. And that's where my guest comes in to tell you how agencies and the government are dealing with this growing threat. Once again, my guest is Todd Probert, the Vice President for Command, Control, Space, and Intelligence with Raytheon's Intelligence, Information, and Services. So Todd, let's just talk about cyber, let's talk about space. Those systems are at risk, whether, again, in orbit or on the ground. Why has this all of a sudden become a much bigger issue?
Well, Jason, I think you said it. The world's becoming more interconnected. I kind of joke, my refrigerator can talk to my toaster and can decide when I'm out of bread, and it can go email Amazon and have bread show up to my house, right? So that's the world we live in, and space is no less different than that. Space has become a good bit more crowded. At one time, it was an exquisite domain of a few nation-state actors that are out there, and if you look over the past couple of years, it's sort of become democratized, right? There's a good bit more countries playing in space, so sovereign space is a focal for a number of nations, a point of pride, and we see more and more folks launching systems. And then, of course, commercial. We've been reliant on communications and GPS for a number of years, but there's a number of new commercial entrants in the system. And with all of that and that interconnectivity, just like anything else, it's a concern for cyber threat.
And the threat is not just, hey, let me hack into your satellite like we see in the movies, right? If you remember the movie Enemy of the State, Will Smith, Gene Hackman, they could hack into the satellite and move the satellite around. It's not that. It's really the systems on the ground as much as it is the ones in space.
Yeah, so you point out a very key point. When a satellite is actually flying, there's very few touch points in terms of how you can get into it. It's that ground control point that's of the most concern.
When you talk about the ground control, what are we talking about? Are we talking about a desktop computer, or are we talking about systems that are, you think of like HAL from 2001? I'm on my movies today, so you can see that.
There you go.
But give me a sense of when we talk about these ground systems.
So once upon a time, the ground system was simply an antenna and a command and control node that talked to a single satellite. But as these satellites, and moreover these constellation of satellites, have become more complex, it's all the mission planning activities that go into it. It's all the data exploitation activities and across the board. So there's just like anything else, there's a number of touch points that you need to worry about. It's those touch points that we work to protect.
And the touch points are being touched by more people too. I mean, if you think about, who's developing, who's making the systems, it's not one company, it's not one set of companies, it's a lot of companies, and maybe Raytheon has a bunch of partners, and you have to worry about supply chain. I mean, all that brings a much higher level of risk.
No, that's exactly it. And one recent command and control system that we fielded for the U.S. Air Force for the GPS constellation. So GPS is the global positioning system. It's the command and control, or rather the navigation and timing that's used for positioning. It's ubiquitous. It's in every car. It's used for syncing timing on the studios today that you have here at WTOP, and then used for any number of purposes, from air traffic to broad transportation to military. Right? It's an important system. We worked with the U.S. Air Force to harden that system to help make it more cyber resilient. In fact, we fielded a system that adheres to 100% of the current DoD information assurance standards. And if you unpack that, it's significant, right? It's the software itself that builds that system, but then all the component parts. So you mentioned the supply chain. Many of those software routines come from third-party suppliers, or what's known as free and open source software in today's vernacular. We needed to go in and make sure that particular piece of code was cyber resilient. So to do that, we had to go basically reinvent how we did software development, and we worked with a number of companies to do that, to build into our processes new standards, new practices to allow for cyber resiliency.
One thing that occurs to me as you talk about is software, meaning how you defend it, how you protect it, or does software that deals with space systems, ground control, orbiting systems, is that any different?
Now the challenge here is software, right? And when you see the cyber threat, it's anything from the kid in his garage to nation-state actors and everything in between. I mean, so there's a number of, they call it the persistent threat, that are of concern, and we work to go protect against that. In GPS and other systems that we build, it's kind of an onion type of defense, to where we build layers upon layers. And then the key point with cyber resiliency is it's always changing. So think of your operating system on your phone or your operating system on your desktop. You routinely get an update to that operating system. Well, that's because software continuously changes, and the cyber threat with it. So that onion approach and the ability to scale as things change is really important.
I know there may be some sensitivities to talk about the Air Force, but so just bear with me for a second. Is this something that the Air Force came to you, Raytheon, and said, hey, we need help? Was it a project you were working on, and as part of that team, you came together with the Air Force and said, how can we make this a little more cyber resilient, a little better protected? Or what's the genesis of it? Because it's not new. We've been talking about cyber for 25 years now.
Sure.
But what was there a factor or a impetus for, hey, let's relook at this GPS?
Yeah, so this contract's many years old. We won it a good number of years ago. The Air Force looking at it because of the criticality of GPS, and again, the ubiquity of the signals and the use of those signals. And the Air Force and the country writ large said, okay, we need to go protect this, and we need to make sure it's as cyber resilient as we possibly can. First of its time software endeavor, so there was a lot of learning that went into it on both the Air Force side and Raytheon side. But we're at a point now where we can go in and say, look, we've done this. We fielded it. It's proven. It's gone through a number of vulnerability assessments, both within Raytheon, but more importantly across the DoD, and it's at its initial operations capability. That's important because it's sort of the standard by which all systems, space systems, command and control systems, will be defined going forward. And it's important for Raytheon because we're really the first company and frankly the only company that's put that level of scrutiny on a software system. So the next time the Air Force or anybody else comes to ask us, we've got those processes in place, those practices. We've built that scar tissue over a number of years to field a system.
And that's exactly where I was going to go next, because I can imagine other agencies that have satellites, NOAA, National Weather Service comes to mind as two of those, or even sometimes if you think about DHS or Justice and what they're doing in that world, those same software approaches could be used for those national security type systems, again, whether it's space or not.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right, Jason. And in fact, we helped the Air Force work through it. In fact, the DoD, they've gone through a refinement of their approach, their standards, if you will, in terms of how to go protect from a cyber resiliency standpoint. Satellite systems and frankly, writ large, all command and control applications across the DoD are looking at this and putting more scrutiny on it. We have gone to great lengths to work with the DoD to refine those standards, to go through risk assessments, vulnerability assessments, and say, this is more important than that. And then we've worked with, and you look at the software development approaches are more modern, and there's a number of companies out there that do what's called code coverage, but code coverage programs where you use this code coverage programs to assess the quality of your software. Those code coverage programs initially started up to check for best practices and to look for good code versus bad code. Over time, we've worked with those companies to refine that to include cyber best practices and to build resiliency into these systems.
That's fascinating, that because software is the one thing that we hear time and again is the biggest risk in many regards when it comes to all systems, again, not just space systems, because humans make software and humans make mistakes. But let's go back around to the space systems and satellites and such, and is this something that people should be worried about? Should the average user, hey, I'm in my car, I'm using Google Maps or Waze or whatever, should I worry about the hacking? Or is this something that at a very high level, the government and companies like Raytheon are that's where that focus should be placed?
Well, I think I'll go back to your point of software, right? So the importance that software has taken on in our lives, and I'm not sure where the inflection point is over the past, but let's call it within the last 10 years. If you look at the cell phone as a rubric for this, as a measure of it. My IT department a year ago now delivered me an iPhone 10, right? So iPhone 10, with some poetic license, I had an iPhone 1 10 years ago, right? But 10 years ago, I also had a CD player. I was pretty excited about this. I had a 3-megapixel camera, which I paid a lot of money for.
Right.
I had
a flashlight.
I had a flashlight, exactly. I had a flashlight. Get this, I read paper books, right? So all of these things, from that iPhone 1 to iPhone 10 or the equivalent in Android, they've been essentially taken out of that hardware space and rebuilt within software in that device. So our lives are becoming more and more software dependent, and I think that's across the board when you look at it. Today, every single one of those instances are within my iPhone 10, and I rely on it more than I ever did, certainly more than I did 10 years ago. That's where software is kind of taken on within our lives. And it's no different in space than it is within your car, than it is within any other thing that you do within your daily lives. It's a concern, and we need to protect it.
And are we protecting it? I know we mentioned earlier on that the hacking, that the risks come from anywhere from some, again, kid in a garage to nation state. But space is quickly becoming an interesting attack vector from nation states, from criminal organizations, because of our reliance on things like GPS, on the information that comes down from satellites and are stored in ground systems. Are we seeing that as a bigger risk? Is the government understanding that that's a much bigger risk?
Well, so my GPS anecdote, certainly, it's been a concern for a while. We're seeing those same cyber requirements, those resiliency requirements get folded into just about every RFP that's been coming out from the government, and more refined as we go forward. We're more concerned about this and more purposeful in the resiliency stuff. Again, not necessarily unique to what we're seeing in the space domain. I think it's across all DoD and frankly even the .gov environment from a software standpoint. It's something that we need to go take and pay appropriate attention to. You just need to pick up just about any newspaper in any given month, and you'll see an instance of some form of cyber attack, be it ransomware or stealing of critical information or whatever. So I think that the collective awareness is raising appropriately and within the Defense Department accordingly.
We've seen some efforts again around supply chain as well, which maybe we'll talk more about.
Sure.
But let's take a quick break. You're listening to Every Side of Cyber, Protecting Space from Hackers, sponsored by Raytheon on Federal News Radio, part of the Federal News Network.